Hello, everybody. My name is Alice Muir. I'm a coastal advocate with 100 Miles. I'm joined here today with Alice Keyes, our VP of Coastal Conservation here at 100 Miles, as well as Rachel Thompson. She's a lead project manager with Glynn Environmental Coalition. And I'd also like to recognize our partners at the Altamaha Riverkeeper for helping us spread the word about this webinar and taking action with us on this issue in our community. We also want to thank you guys for tuning in to this webinar and continuing to support us as we put our effort toward making our community a safer and a healthier place for everyone to live. If you've never joined us for an action webinar before, the way this works is we start with a little bit of the background on the issue. We then move to the current circumstances, and then from there we talk about how you guys at home can take action for your community. So if you follow along to the next slide, you're going to see our agenda for today. So we're going to start out with a little bit of history from Alice Keyes about the Glynn County Superfund sites, and then we'll move on to Rachel Thompson as she covers kind of the science and toxicology behind Toxaphene, and we'll go back over to Alice Keyes to cover the proposed cleanup or the consent decree, and then finally we'll end with myself, Alex Muir, as I talk about ways that you guys can take action. So with that, we're going to move along. And I'm going to hand it over to Alice Keyes to talk about the history and the terms of Superfund sites.
Thanks, Alex, and thanks to everybody participating tonight in the webinar. The situation at Terry Creek is very important to us in the Golden Isles, and the challenges we face with the contamination are quite serious and in many cases very personal. As Alex said, my role tonight will be to walk you through a bit of the history of how we got where we are with the Terry Creek site and the time-sensitive situation that we're in now. But before I get into that, I want to take some time to make sure that we're all starting from the same point. So if you progress to the next slide, I'm going to walk you through a few terms that we're going to talk about throughout the webinar tonight. So the term Superfund is one that we generally know, but officially Superfund is an informal term for a formal program managed by the United States Environmental Protection Agency. It all started because, for a number of reasons, commercial and industrial wastes were mismanaged in some way and pose an unacceptable risk to human health and the environment. Those instances may be intentional or unintentional, but pollutants of this type are dumped on the ground or in waterways, left out in the open, or otherwise just improperly managed. And as a result, thousands of hazardous waste sites are found throughout the United States. And these hazardous waste sites are commonly include manufacturing facilities, processing plants, landfills, sometimes mining sites. And so in 1980, the U.S. Congress passed the Comprehensive Environmental Response, Compensation, and Liability Act, or CERCLA, as the acronym is referred. And this was in response to the growing number of environmental and health risks that were posed by this growing number of hazardous waste sites. Some of you may remember a couple of the instances that led to the passage of CERCLA, the Love Canal and the Valley of the Drums back in the 1970s. So when Congress passed CERCLA, it became informally known as the Superfund program, because officially Superfund sites are defined as any land in the United States that have been contaminated by hazardous waste and identified by the EPA as a candidate for cleanup because it poses a risk to human health and the environment. And some of these Superfund sites get placed on the National Priorities List, or NPL. And this is a list of hazardous waste sites in the country that are eligible for funding to pay for the extensive or long-term cleanup actions under the Superfund remedial program. And you get on the list by being ranked a high priority because of the harm to human health and the environment. Another term that you'll hear a lot throughout the webinar and throughout discussions about Superfund sites is the term potentially responsible parties. And this is the group or groups who generated or transported the hazardous waste and the owners or operators of the site where the contamination is found. In many situations, identifying responsible parties can be logistically and legally challenging, but in the case of Terry Creek, the only responsible party in this particular case is Hercules, LLC. So if you progress to the next to the next slide, you'll see that in Glynn County, or actually in the state of Georgia, we have 16 Superfund sites on the national priorities list. 5 of those national priorities list sites are in Glynn County, including the Hercules site itself. And that's because it includes, that number 5 includes the list of sites that are on the list right now, but are also proposed to be on the list. And what's interesting about the Terry Creek Superfund site is that it was nominated by EPA in 1997 to be on the national priorities list, but for whatever reason, it was never finalized. So ultimately, EPA is not responsible for paying for the cleanup of the site. Of the sites that are considered Superfund, there are 6 sites in Glynn County that have been that are considered hazardous but have been cleaned up, and 11 sites in Glynn County that are considered hazardous but are not part of the national priorities list. But you know, those contain some level of dangerous contamination, but again are not prioritized because of the harm that they pose to human health and the environment. So if you progress to the next slide, you can see the situation where Pinova is currently operating is the site where the Hercules plant has operated since the 1920s. And when we refer to this Terry Creek Superfund site, it's kind of a catch-all phrase for all of the areas that were contaminated by activities of the Hercules company, primarily from 1940s to 1980s. So if you progress to the next slide, you'll see that the Hercules site, I'm on slide number 7 for those of you who are following diligently. Hercules has operated at the site on Highway 17 since about 1920, and that's the area that's shaded in red there. They still operate today. Some of the processes have changed and been updated, but they still have an active wastewater discharge that travels under Highway 17 in the red arrow to an outfall ditch that is actually east of Highway 17. And then that wastewater is then discharged into Dupree Creek that is in the orange, and then eventually it flows into Terry Creek, actually labeled on Google Maps as Fancy Bluff Creek, but you can see it's a tributary of Fancy Bluff Creek. And so it's a fully tidal system that carries wastewater to and from the neighborhood and the area just between Fancy Bluff Creek and the Torres Causeway there. So if you progress to the next slide, we're going to start talking now a little bit about the history of Hercules at Terry Creek. So industrial operations really began at the Hercules site back in 1911. Hercules Incorporated began operations in 1920, and they began operating as a facility that extracts wood rosin from product to produce resins that are used in all sorts of products. Today, they are still operating in that capacity, producing high-quality resins that are used in all sorts of food products and other over-the-counter products that you can buy at the store. They have had numerous owners over the course of many years, and most recently, the current facility is owned by DRTA and is operating as Pinova. But most important to today's topic is that between 1948 and 1980, Hercules, Inc. operated a pesticide production facility that manufactured Toxaphene, a chlorinated pesticide that's used on crops. And Rachel's going to go into a lot more detail about what Toxaphene is and the dangers that this pesticide has caused for humans and for the environment. Well, another good important point to note is that Hercules actually went on to patent Toxaphene in 1951. So it was such a lucrative operation for them that they patented the production of this pesticide. During the time that Hercules manufactured Toxaphene, the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers actually periodically dredged Dupree Creeks and Terry Creeks. That's an important fact to think about when we look at the scale of the contaminated area, because a lot of the wastewater and the contaminants that were in the wastewater have been found in the dredged spoil as well. So looking at the timeline of events to help us orient us to where we are today, Again, Hercules patented Toxaphene in 1950. It was only in 1980 that Toxaphene was recognized as a substance that causes damage to fish and animals, so it's considered a toxic chemical. So in 1982, EPA banned most uses of Toxaphene, and then in 1990 they banned all uses of Toxaphene. And then in 1997, Dupree and Terry Creeks were proposed for the National Priorities List. It was never finalized again. But in the late 1990s, Hercules actually conducted some cleanup activities to remove some of the contaminated sediments at the outfall ditch, and in some sites in Dupree Creek and Terry Creek. So if you progress to the next slide, you'll see that the areas where Hercules has conducted some excavation of the contaminated sediments, about 35,000 cubic yards of contaminated sediment were removed and disposed of at an off-site landfill. And you can see that map on slide 9 there. So if you go back to the history of the timeline, I'm going to continue to build into some of the more recent activities. Following the sediment removal, EPA and Hercules did some more sampling of fish tissue and sediment and water quality, only to realize that the contaminated sites spanned far beyond the ditch and into the creeks, and a great deal of the dredge contaminated soils were disposed of in the marsh area at different locations, that neighborhood just south of Riverside. So to help with the planning of the cleanup to operations on such a large site, EPA ended up breaking up the Terry Creek Superfund site. Again, that's a kind of umbrella term. EPA broke up the Terry Creek Superfund site into what they call operable units. So if you progress to slide number 11, you can see the different operable units and how EPA has broken it out. And so operable unit 1, which is what we are going to spend most of our time discussing today, is shaded in blue. And if you keep progressing, you can see the next shaded in green is operable unit 2, which includes the upland areas and the dredge spoil areas. Remember, I said the dredging occurred by the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers before 1980, and that was to keep navigation open and to keep flow of those creeks moving. And then operable unit 3 actually addresses the creeks themselves. And so those areas, the operable unit 3 is shaded in brown. And so that's all kind of described in this slide here. And you can see, again, we're going to spend most of our time, what brings us here today is the discussion of operable unit 1 only. All right. And so here's if you progress to slide number 12, you can see an aerial, close-up aerial of operable unit 1. All right. So in 2012, EPA began field investigations to really begin planning for cleanup of the site. It was only 30 years after they banned the chemical, but much of the delay was due to the fact that the testing methods that EPA had on file or had been approved to conduct only accounted for manufactured toxaphene, not weathered toxaphene. And again, Rachel's going to get into that in just a little bit. But as a result of the investigations, EPA proposed a cleanup plan for operable unit 1 in 2015. In that plan, they described preferred cleanup. They described a series of alternatives for cleaning up operable unit 1. And according to EPA, they prioritized the investigation into operable unit 1 over operable units 2 and 3 because the fish tissue sampling conducted by the Georgia Environmental Protection Division found that game fish are potentially exposed to the toxaphene concentrations in their food prey. And Rachel is going to get into this in a little bit more. But some of the sampling that EPD had done on fish tissue actually caused EPA to prioritize operable unit 1 in 2015. Because Rachel's going to describe now how why the prioritization of the cleanup is imperative to our community, and is going to explain to you a little bit more about how toxaphene affects us and wildlife in our area.
Thank you so much, Alice. We're going to come back to the proposed cleanup plan for Terry Creek Superfund site outfall ditch, but before we do that, like Alice mentioned, I'm going to take the opportunity to dig a little bit deeper into what toxaphene is. So if you can click forward to slide 16, you will see images of advertisements that were printed in agricultural journals and magazines back in the 1940s and 50s by Hercules advertising their pesticide product. So what is Toxaphene? Our Hercules Powder Company, now known as Hercules LLC, began producing Toxaphene in the late 1940s. Toxaphene was marketed and sold as an insecticide. Many farmers started using it primarily in cotton fields in the South, but for other purposes as well. If you click forward on slide 16, it will pull up a picture of Cooper Tox, which was an ad for toxaphene to be used as a cattle or livestock dip to keep insects off of the livestock. It wasn't heavily used until the late 60s, and it reached its peak production in 1975 at almost 60 million pounds produced annually. Hercules noted in their patent application how effective the chemical was at killing insects, even with very little of the product mixed into water or other solvents. As Alice mentioned earlier, toxaphene was banned first in the United States in 1990 by the EPA, but then it wasn't actually banned globally until 2001. Click forward to slide 17. When Hercules patented toxaphene, they actually patented the operating procedures of the production of the chemical. It wasn't just a patent for one chemical compound. Toxaphene is formed by mixing a chemical called camphene with chlorine gas. During the mixing, the chlorines will attach to the camphenes. How much chlorine attaches to each camphene was different every batch, and therefore the patent protected toxaphene includes over 670 different chemical compositions, with 40% to 70% of the weight of the molecule as chlorine, or can also be described as having 3 to 10 chlorine molecules per each camphene. This can be a little bit confusing, but the image on the slide shows a few of the different congeners of toxaphene. This basically means when they are mixing the camphenes with the chlorines, again, those chlorines are going to attach in different ways. So there are 670 different ways that those chlorines can attach to the camphene. This image here just shows a few. Go forward to slide 18. So why is there toxaphene in Terry Creek? This is a press release from Hercules Powder Company in 1949 on the supply and price of toxaphene. The toxaphene that was sold commercially had strictly 67 to 69% chlorine. However, as I previously mentioned, in the process of making toxaphene, Hercules had chemical compositions with between 40 and 75% chlorine, which means that they made a lot of chemicals that they did not have the correct amount of chlorines attached for them to sell. So they disposed of them. At its peak production, Hercules was dumping 200 to 300 pounds of waste per day through its wastewater discharge pipe, what we now call the outfall ditch, which runs into Dupree and Terry Creek. Large amounts of toxaphene manufacturing waste are also present at the Hercules 009 landfill Superfund site, located near the current Altama Elementary School. That was a result of them bringing those manufacturing waste by truckload to the landfill that was located there. Progress forward to slide 19. Toxaphene and its manufacturing waste do not break apart easily. They can stay in the water and soil for a very long time. This was part of the reason it was such an effective pesticide and it was marketed that way. This ad was produced by Hercules and it states, toxaphene remains effective 5 to 7 days after treatment, which was different from other insecticides that usually only stayed effective a day or two after it was applied. So toxaphene was much more effective long term, hence why they called it the 7-day wonder in this advertisement. However, this ad also incorrectly states that year after year, carefully conducted studies show no toxaphene remaining in the soil in amounts of biological importance. I'm going to explain over time why it has been difficult to measure the amount of toxaphene in the environment. Progress to slide 20. Part of the reason it has been so difficult to understand the toxicity of toxaphene is because there are different ways that it has been measured or classified. So to truly understand the toxicity of toxaphene, we must understand how they classify the different types of toxaphene. The first type is the toxaphene patent, which essentially, again, it protected the manufacturing procedures or the protocols to produce toxaphene, which included those 670 different chemical congeners that I described earlier. The second is what we call technical toxaphene, and that was actually what was sold commercially and used as insecticides on farmer fields. That is what strictly contains the 67 to 69% chlorine. And then you have the weather toxaphene, which I like to say is essentially everything else. It includes the degraded toxaphene that's persistent in the environment after being spread on farmer fields, but it also includes the manufacturing waste from production that could not be sold as toxaphene and that were disposed of either in the landfill at Hercules 009 or in the outfall ditch present here at Terry Creek. As toxaphene remains in the environment, the chlorines begin to come apart from the camphene. Each time a chlorine is removed, it becomes a slightly different chemical, eventually turning it into a chemical that is no longer considered toxaphene by Hercules. The reason why they weren't finding any toxaphene when they were searching for it on the farmer's field is that the technical toxaphene was no longer existed. The EPA released a toxicity assessment report for toxaphene this summer, and it included two very important points. One was that there's very little information on whether toxaphene to complete a toxicity assessment the way that they do for a single chemical. So what that basically means is because of the 670 congeners, they would have to do a complete toxicity assessment of each one of those congeners to completely understand the toxicity of this chemical that was patented as toxaphene, which is much more substantial than if they were going to do a toxicity assessment for one single chemical. But also, by using some uncertainty factors in their calculations, the EPA estimates that weather toxaphene is 300 times more toxic than technical toxaphene that was sold to farmers as an insecticide. And if you scoot forward to slide 21, some of the impacts of toxaphene they're difficult to understand, again, because of the unavailability of the information needed to completely understand that toxicity. But by looking at the impacts of technical toxaphene, which is that 67 to 69% chlorine chemical makeup, we can get a basic understanding of the impacts of toxaphene as a whole. So what we know about technical toxaphene from the CDC is small amounts of toxaphene can kill fish, and what doesn't kill them gets passed on to larger animals or humans that are consuming them. This is what we call bioaccumulation. So a smaller fish will consume toxaphene, and if it doesn't kill that smaller fish, eventually that toxaphene will get stored in their fatty tissues. As a predator eats those smaller fish, the toxaphene accumulates up the food chain. You can also see impacts to the nervous system, such as convulsions if ingested in large quantities. Tests on lab animals showed damage to liver and kidneys, effects on the immune system, possible liver or thyroid cancers, and changes in fetal development. And again, most of those lab tests were done on either mice or rats. The EPA has stated that it is a probable human carcinogen, and also it can be if it's ingested by nursing mothers, it can be passed through to infants through breast milk. Even if you're exposed to toxaphene, you might not be harmed, and whether you are harmed depends on factors such as the dose, or how much, the duration, or how long, and how you contact it, which is through the air, water, or ingestion. And with that, I'm going to pass it back to Alice, and she's going to talk a little bit more about the proposed cleanup.
Thanks, Rachel. So what I'm going to do now is just talk to you about the proposed cleanup, but I want to really emphasize what Rachel had said about the type of toxaphene that is in the Cherry Creek site, especially in operable Unit 1. Again, the chemical was banned in 1980, and it's taken this long for the EPA to begin to finalize a cleanup plan. So what we're talking about is not produced toxaphene. What we're talking about is the weathered toxaphene that has the potential to be 300 times more toxic than the pesticide that was produced. So the proposed cleanup plan, if you progress to slide number 23, you'll see that, again, in 2015, EPA proposed a cleanup plan for operable Unit 1. And so I'm going to talk you through the alternatives that were discussed in that proposed cleanup plan and the preferred plan that EPA and Hercules identified. And then take you to just last year, EPA released what they call an interim record of decision, describing what the actions that Hercules would be responsible for in implementing that cleanup plan. And then bring us to this year. In 2018, the Department of Justice has gotten involved in the process to spur Hercules to actually act on the cleanup plan itself. So again, if you progress to slide number 24, you'll see we're just talking about a small portion, a 2.5-acre area of the entirety of the Cherry Creek site, operable Unit 1, the outfall ditch. So if you progress to the next slide, you'll see that in 2015, EPA released a document that outlined about 7 alternatives that they had evaluated to determine the best way to clean up the outfall ditch at Cherry Creek. The options included everything from, the range of activities from doing nothing. It's always an option that you look at, that you investigate in situations like this. They also looked at, several compilations of cleanup plans, including armoring the area, removing various levels of sediment. But what they chose to focus on in what they call their preferred alternative was described as Alternative 4, which is defined as a concrete line channel rerouted with limited sediment removal. I also need to point out that this is actually the least expensive alternative described in that document that was released by EPA in 2015. So when EPA released the document in 2015, they opened the opportunity for the public to comment on their preferred alternative and to investigate the other alternatives and just to offer some public opinion about it. So if you progress to slide 26, you'll see that a summary of what EPA and Hercules had preferred with the cleanup plan, and what generally came to be known as the community preference for cleaning up the outfall ditch or operable Unit 1 at Cherry Creek. And so some of the comparisons that you can see are, again, the cost. The preferred method or the preferred cleanup plan that EPA had selected roughly cost about $3 million. Minimal sediment removal, about 1,200 cubic yards of sediment removal, a rerouting of the outfall ditch into a concrete lined and open channel. And then, they would allow for a covering of some of the other contaminated areas and capping of some of that contaminated sites, but it would not be candidate for brownfield or redevelopment in the future. And some of the alternatives that the community has supported really cost, roughly upwards of almost $6.5 million. The removal of a lot more of the contaminated sediment on the site, about from 36 to almost 10,000 cubic yards of contaminated sediment, but to cover up the outfall ditch, to reroute it, but also cover it to allow for brownfield redevelopment in the future. It would eliminate the exposure of those toxins to both wildlife and humans, but also allow for the Golden Isles to take advantage of what is really considered a pretty nicely situated gateway to our community. The Glynn County Commission, if you progress to slide 27, you'll see some copies of the resolutions that were passed by the Glynn County Commission and the Brunswick City Commission. Both passed unanimous resolutions asking EPA to require Hercules to remove nearly all of the contaminated sediments and to culvert the discharge ditch to limit exposure to the remaining toxins. So that, again, the public opinion was to get more of the contaminated sediments out and to cover up the stuff that's there to limit the exposure to wildlife and to humans. So after the public comment period closed in 2015, EPA took back all of those comments and processed them and responded. There's an official response document that they released when they released what they call the Interim Record of Decision. If you progress to slide number 28, you can see that Interim Record of Decision, also known as an IROD, was released in June of 2017, and it outlines the agency's preferred plan to remediate operable Unit 1 and the outfall ditch. While they updated the proposal a little bit, a few changes were made to accommodate public input. The plan largely remained the same. Basically, to armor the backfill slope of the ditch and to reroute it, but to keep it an open channel that is concreted in. But what was really interesting to those of us who were following this pretty closely is that the description of the record of decision as being interim. And EPA justified this interim by saying, at present, an EPA-approved toxicity value for weathered toxaphene is not available. When an EPA toxicity value for weathered toxaphene is developed, EPA will reassess potential risks associated with operable Unit 1 to determine if further actions are needed. And that is a quote from the documents that EPA released back in 2017. So basically they're saying this cleanup plan is going to get us by until we know more about weathered toxaphene. So the interim record of decision was released in 2017, and if you progress to slide number 29, you'll see that for whatever reason, Hercules never moved on that interim record of decision. Maybe it was because it was called interim, so they didn't think they needed to do anything with it. So they were inactive for about a year or so until earlier this year, the U.S. Department of Justice filed an official complaint with the District Court of the Southern District of Georgia to require that Hercules perform the interim response actions to clean up the outfall ditch, and also to reimburse EPA and the Department of Justice for the cost of Hercules' inaction. In response to the complaint, Hercules and EPA were able to work out a settlement agreement in which Hercules agrees to implement the actions in the IROD and to pay back DOJ. So the consent decree really is a finalization of the settlement agreement between Hercules and EPA. So what happened between the time that the consent decree was released, a open public comment in May of 2018 on the consent decree itself, and public comment period was scheduled to close in August of 2018. But in that time period, EPA it was actually just 2 weeks before the public comment period was supposed to end, in which the National Center for Environmental Assessment, a branch of EPA, released the long-awaited technical report on the toxicity values of weathered toxaphene and toxaphene cogeners. So that report was released on July 31st, 2018. As a result of the release of this quite pertinent information, the Department of Justice extended the deadline for public comments until September 20th, allowing us, the public, a lot more time to review the toxicity report and to come back with some constructive public comments on the consent decree. So ultimately, if the judge rules to approve the consent decree, it will require Hercules to implement an inadequate plan that's outlined in the IROD. It's a really big deal because, as we discussed, the actions in the IROD do not go far enough to protect the people and the wildlife here in the Golden Isles. So if you progress to slide number 30, I want to walk you through a little bit more about the contents of the consent decree and why this is a unique opportunity for us. But what we're talking about now is the public comment period is open now to address the consent decree. And this is a big deal because the consent decree would basically, in our opinion, it was issued prematurely. It finalizes this interim remediation plan that does not account for the toxicity of the weathered toxaphene, and it does not alleviate those toxins that threaten our community. Since 2005, EPA has recognized that additional study and research is needed really to determine the toxicity of the chemicals that are in our environment. And so part of what we are really asking folks to do now is to go and ask the Department of Justice to not finalize or to not approve the consent decree that would finalize the interim record of decision. And specifically in the cleanup plan that is being finalized, one of the things that we found general consensus, including all of the City Commission of Brunswick, the county commissioners, and all the NGOs and the public that recommended that EPA select an alternative cleanup plan that removed more, if not all, of the contamination on the site. And in their response to comments, EPA even said that they are willing to design a remedy that will allow the city to reuse the property. And if that's the case, why can't they go with an alternative that's better suited for the reuse of that particular area? So if you move forward a little bit more to slide number 31, our city and county commissioners invited the EPA to give an overview of the consent decree during a work session on August the 20th. During that work session, Scott Martin, who is with the EPA and the manager responsible for overseeing the cleanup plan, offered the justification for moving forward and finalizing the IROD through the approval of the consent decree. And basically all he was able to offer was to say that if we move forward with this cleanup plan, we are saving taxpayers money, over $5 million. And if you recall, this justification that EPA is offering is because this site is not listed as a national priorities list. Hercules has agreed to pay for the cleanup because they are the responsible party. So in EPA's mind, the proposed remedy is saving taxpayers money. So ultimately, if you progress one more slide, what we're looking at is it may be a good plan for the federal government, but it remains a very bad plan for the Golden Isles. And from our perspective, if you progress to slide number 32, the County Commission Chairman Brunson represented our opinion very well, that the majority of Glynn County citizens, he said, and I quote, "The County Commission and the City Commission, I don't know how you can get a more blended opinion of your community than these two. We are the elected officials, and what we said was that this fix isn't acceptable. We don't want to bury this stuff and to leave it in the ground in Glynn County." So where we find ourselves now is a very unique opportunity. The Terry Creek Superfund site is a very complicated situation. And in 2015, and in 2018, the public has an opportunity to offer our opinion about what EPA is proposing. This is one of those opportunities. The Department of Justice is legally bound to accept public comments during the consent decree before it goes before a district court to rule either in favor of or to deny the consent decree as it's written. So now I'm going to turn it over to Alex, who can talk you through the best ways for you as citizens and us to engage with the EPA, to engage with the Department of Justice and our other federal agencies in this particular situation.
All right, thank you so much, Alice. So I'm going to wrap it up here with just a few ideas of how you guys can take action in our community. So moving on to slide number 34, the place that I want to start with you guys is with the Glynn County Commissioners. Currently, the Glynn County Commissioners haven't said whether or not they're going to speak in favor or opposition of the consent decree. But what you see here is a template that you can click on where it says click here that will take you to an email straight to your commissioners that says, please comment on this consent decree and explain to the EPA and the DOJ and everybody else who's going to read this comment that we will not stand for this pollution to continue to be released into our community and to be in the sediment as well as the outfall ditch. And so this template, you can use it and send it to both your city and your county commissioners, but they are scheduled to take a vote on a joint resolution at their September 18th work session. So we would ask for you guys to email this before the September 18th work session so that they can get the feedback that they need from their community. If you feel even more compelled to get in touch with your commissioners, you can go one step further and make a call to them and let them know what you're thinking about their comments and their official comments on the Terry Creek site. And something that might be helpful in doing that is our talking points kind of fact sheet document that we have here. It's linked here as well. And it's just got some common questions that people ask about Terry Creek and the right answers for them, the accurate answers, as well as some interesting facts about the site and the history of the site, as well as toxaphene, the contaminant found at the site. So that is where we're asking people to take action in our community specifically. We want to make sure that our county and our city commissioners know that their official comments are important to us and they mean a lot to the Department of Justice as well, and that we want them to speak out against this consent decree and this planned cleanup at the Terry Creek site. Moving on to slide number 35, these are some resources for helping you write your comments, your own personal comments, to the Department of Justice. And these comments will be due on September 20th. Fortunately, there is a way to submit these comments via email, and so it's very simple to pull up our draft email, which we have here, and then send it in through the website. However, you do need to note that unlike your emails or your phone calls to your city and county commissioners, your comments that are made to the Department of Justice do need to be personalized. And so that means you need to pull out what about the Terry Creek cleanup is important to you. What are you most concerned about? And you can do that by using both our draft email and the talking points or the fact sheet document that was on the previous slide and kind of pulling out the issues that mean the most to you and also suggesting your own ideas about what concerns you with this cleanup plan for our community. And then on that second link, what you'll see in the click here is for the email to send your comments into the Department of Justice. So moving on to slide number 36, these are just a few resources for you guys to reference. So, and a few more casual ways for you guys to take action. So the first thing you see here is to share with your family and friends. So that right there is a link to our Facebook page, 100 Miles, and we are always sharing things that are easy to spread around with your community, people you talk to every day. And so it's just a really great way to kind of keep things on people's mind and keep it in the conversations. We also have in the second circle you see there, click here to dig into the details. So that is a link to the interim record of decision, as well as some of the other documents that the EPA has put out for the public to review. So you can dig into the details there, and so you can have a more informed conversation with those who are interested in engaging around the subject. And then finally, we ask that you guys stay in touch with us. So that link that says OHM will take you right to the place where you can sign up to receive our newsletters, our monthly newsletters, and you can follow along with us as we cover these issues and as we take action along with Glynn Environmental Coalition on this issue as well as other issues in our community. And with that, we're going to move on to our questions portion. So as you guys have been going through this, there could have been a lot of questions that came up, and we are always here to answer questions to the best of our ability or put you in touch with those people that we may know that can answer your questions. So if you have any questions about the Terry Creek consent decree, interim record of decision, or any of the other documents or circumstances around this issue, please feel free to reach out to any one of us, and we'll be happy to get you in touch with the people that may have your answer or answer it ourselves if we can do that. And with that, I'd like to say thank you so much for joining us. Rachel, thanks so much for being here today, as well as Alice Kais. And we will look forward to seeing you guys at the work session on September 18th at 2 p.m. at the Harold Pate Building. And also seeing comments that may roll in. If you guys have any questions about your comments before you send them on September 20th, please let us know. We're happy to help you guys take a look at them. So thanks so much.
Thank you.
Yeah, can I ask a question?
Of course. And can I ask who's speaking?
Hey, this is Jim Renner.
Jim. Hey, Jim. How are you?
Good.
Good.
Thank you for the presentation. So the DOJ filed the complaint, and the DOJ has issued a consent decree on which the public is expected to comment. Is that correct?
That is correct. Yes.
And so the consent decree is what? It's telling Hercules that they have to implement the remedy, but we really have no further. But they're considering that there's no further debate about the preferred remedy.
So this is Rachel, Jim, to answer your question. The complaint that was filed by the Department of Justice and the consent decree are two separate things. The consent decree is actually something that is outlined by lawyers with the EPA and Hercules, and then essentially presented to the Department of Justice to be filed and then open for public comment period. So Hercules and EPA attorneys sat down and decided that this was the remedy that they wanted to go forth with the interim record of decision. And then they filed that with the legal arm of the federal government, which is the Department of Justice. Does that kind of answer your question? And if you need to elaborate.
I still want to make sure I understand what I'm commenting on.
Yes, it would be comments on the proposed cleanup that's outlined in the consent decree.
Okay. And in the interim record of decision, was there a comparison of the amount of toxaphene and whether toxaphene that would be removed versus the residual toxaphene that would remain for each of the cleanup alternatives?
I don't believe so. I don't believe that it's actually outlined in terms of, say cubic yards or residual toxaphene. They talk about how much sediment they are going to be removing specifically in the different alternatives, but it's not outlined exactly, how much they estimate is going to be left behind. And I think a part of that too is because of the fact, again, that there are extreme difficulties in measuring how much is exactly there.
I guess so do we have a basis? This is not a criticism, I'm just asking.
Mm-hmm.
Do we have a basis for asserting that removing more dirt is better than the preferred alternative?
So there was a preliminary removal of sediment that was done. I think it was in the 90s. Do you know the exact year?
It was 1999 and 2000. 35,000 cubic yards of sediment was removed.
And they did see an improvement by testing the fish tissue, that there was a decrease in the toxins, but then since then the level has plateaued. They've seen no improvement of there being less toxins in the fish tissue that they're sampling. So from that, I think it's safe to surmise that by removing more sediment, we would see a decrease in the toxins. But like Rachel was saying, it's very hard to actually measure the toxaphene in its various forms. And so they do not include that in their alternatives analysis of how much would be taken out with the varying degrees of sediment removed. But there is...
Was there any...
Go ahead.
Was there any base for making the decision on the preferred alternative other than cost?
We cannot comment on why the EPA and Hercules chose that alternative over others, though cost could be one of them. It's kind of the smoking gun, if you will, as to why they would have chosen that alternative over the others, especially considering that the voice from our elected officials and our community is resounding that that remedy is not what we are looking for in terms of a cleanup. It doesn't go as far as we want it to, so I would say that cost would be the first thing, but there could be other reasons outside of that, but we don't know what those are.
I've got a question. My name is Sharon.
Hey Sharon, go ahead.
Hey. Okay, so it seems like maybe the commissioners are having a little bit, or people locally are having a little bit of buyer's remorse here about not having this site declared on the national registry. Is there an option for us to go backward and have that done so that we can actually maybe affect a better cleanup here? Because everybody's saying, well, we're just doing this to save you guys money. Isn't that wonderful? But now everybody's saying, geez, it's just not so wonderful. Okay, so is there an option to say, we don't want any of this, and we want, what kind of leverage do we have to actually maybe say we would want to have this site reclassified? Is that even an option?
That's a really good question. And as far as let me start with answering the second part of your question first. From what I understand, because the consent decree was agreed to through the legal channels with the Department of Justice, it will eventually have to be approved by a judge in the district court. And so the judge actually can, if he or she finds that the decree is either unlawful or unreasonable or inadequate to protect the public health and the environment, they can deny the finalization of the consent decree. And in that case, the parties, EPA and Hercules, would have to renegotiate or renegotiate to find a better solution. So again, this is an opportunity for the public to get Hercules and EPA to come up with a better plan that Hercules would again agree to cover the cost of. Part of the reason we were talking about this before the webinar, we think that the operable unit 1 is a small area, and the cleanup that has been proposed would not exceed $5 million. Whereas if you look at the whole of the Terry Creek Superfund site, that area is monstrous. So it is unlikely that we are going to find a responsible party that would fess up to being the sole responsible party for that area. So I don't think at this stage it's possible to go back and say, well, we changed our minds on the national priorities list. But it is worth looking into in the future, and I definitely think it's something to consider for operable unit 2 and 3.
I would say that the question that we would need to answer is to figure out the mechanism of getting a site listed on the national priorities list that's already been proposed. because it was proposed in the 90s, and so considering it's been, coming on 20, 25 years, I'm unsure of how that process would take place, but answering that question will help us see whether or not that is an option.
Okay. All right. It just seems like it took them a while, local people a while to wake up here, but anyway, that's regrettable. But I have another question about this ditch. So my understanding is that's still being used by Panova, and if it's still being used, what's coming out of it, and who's minding the store there? That's a little bit of a concern.
So you are correct that Panova is still functioning on the west side of 17, and the outfall ditch does function as their wastewater discharge, and that is all managed through a state NPDES permit, and the facility is also being managed under RCRA, which is the Resource Conservation Reclamation Act. And that's, that the RCRA is addressing some of the contamination that's been left over on the site from Hercules, whereas the NPDES permit, they have to maintain testing for everything that they discharge out of there. So that is being monitored by the state.
Okay. Mm-hmm. Well, that's encouraging.
Mm-hmm.
All right, so we're just at about time now. We said we were going to finish around 6:30, but we want to make sure we get to any other questions. So I'm going to check the email really quick. Okay, I have one here, but I want to just open it up to you guys one more time. Do you guys have any questions? Going once? Going twice? Okay, so Stephanie, I have your email here, and you're wanting to know why exactly, let me read this right. So why do we need to personalize the Department of Justice emails? Why does that make a difference? So, Rachel, you want to take it?
Yeah, I'll go ahead and answer that question. Essentially, in some cases, when you're writing comment letters to the state or the federal government, they will take what they call form letters, which is when an organization outlines a letter and distributes it either via email or U.S. mail, and they will accept all of those individual letters as individual letters. So if 100 letters get sent in, then all 100 of those letters will be considered. In this case, with the Department of Justice, those form letters are representing the voice of the organization that wrote them, and so they will consider it one letter if there's not substantial personalization. It doesn't mean that you have to change every sentence within our templates, but what's really important is to describe why this is important to you, and how the appropriate cleanup will impact our community and especially impact your life or well-being here in Glynn County. And if you elaborate on that, that will personalize those letters, and the information that's important for the DOJ, some of the questions that we want to ask, those can stay very similar to the template, but you definitely want to include that personalization in there.
All right, guys. Well, thanks so much for hanging on tonight. I know that was some pretty dense information. If any other questions come your way, if you're pondering over this information tonight, feel free to send us an email or get in touch with us in the following few days if you'd like some help with your DOJ letter. Other than that, I think we're going to sign off for tonight, and we look forward to working with you guys on some action webinars in the future. If you need a good laugh, you can scroll along to the next slide. We have a comic that is based on Toxaphene, which is a pretty unique comic. I don't know how funny we can make this issue, but hopefully you guys will take these action steps pretty seriously. So thank you so much for joining us tonight.
Thank y'all.
Okay,
Thank you.
Thank you very much.